A world of ice had begun to die. For generations, it had been a kingdom of white silence, a landscape carved by frost and ruled by the biting wind. But now, the great thaw was coming. In the cold shadows of a melting glacier, a tribe clung to survival. This was not merely a change of seasons. It was the end of their world, a world their ancestors had only ever known in shades of white and blue. The air carried a strange new scent, not of snow, but of damp earth, of rot, and of a danger they could not yet name. The tribe's elder, Kael, was a man whose eyes held the wisdom and weariness of 100 winters. He had lived his life by the rhythms of the ice, understanding its laws and teaching his people how to endure its brutal embrace. But now, that understanding felt like a fading echo. Each dawn, the sun felt a little warmer, a little more aggressive. Each night, the sound of meltwater rushing from the glacier grew from a trickle to a roar. He watched his sons, their faces still young enough to see the thaw as a blessing, a promise of easier hunts and less bitter nights. They did not see what he saw. They did not feel the deep, unsettling tremor in the ground beneath their feet, a vibration that spoke not of life, but of collapse. Their camp was a fragile fortress of mammoth bones and stretched hides, huddled against a rock face that offered some protection from the elements. But the elements were changing. Water dripped relentlessly from the overhangs, turning the packed snow around their hearth to a dark, clinging mud. The children, once accustomed to playing on solid ice, now slipped and fell in the slush, their laughter tinged with a new uncertainty. The hunters returned with less and less, their usual prey, the great woolly beasts, having moved on, following the retreating cold to lands unknown. Hunger was a quiet predator, stalking the edges of their camp, its presence felt in the hollow eyes of the mothers and the silent, gnawing emptiness in their own bellies. One evening, as the tribe gathered around the central fire, a massive crack echoed from the heart of the glacier. It was a sound deeper and more violent than any they had ever heard, like the groan of a dying god. The ground shook, and a shower of ice shards rained down on the valley below. Panic flickered in the eyes of the people. This was not the familiar crackle of shifting ice. This was a scream. Kael rose slowly, his old bones aching with a premonition he could not voice. He looked towards the colossal wall of ice that had been their constant, silent neighbor for all of memory. It was weeping, bleeding rivers from 1,000 wounds. The last winter was not ending. It was being murdered. And as the world they knew dissolved around them, a single, terrifying question began to form in the heart of every man, woman, and child. When the ice is gone, what will be left of us? Asterisk, in a world dissolving into water and mud, the fire was there. Only anchor, it was more than warmth. It was memory, a living link to the ancestors who had first tamed it. The fire was their tribe's soul, and its keeper was not a warrior or a hunter, but the smallest of them all. A young girl named Alara, whose hands were barely large enough to cup the embers, was given the sacred duty. She was the youngest child, chosen not for her strength, but for her innocence, a belief that the purest heart was needed to guard their most precious possession. Her world shrank to the size of a clay pot, where a single glowing coal pulsed with a life she was sworn to protect. Alara did not carry a spear or a shaman's rattle. Her tool was a hollowed-out horn, through which she would gently breathe life back into the fading ember when the damp air threatened to extinguish it. She walked with a quiet solemnity that belied her years, her eyes fixed on the small, leather-wrapped bundle she carried against her chest. While other children played in the growing puddles of meltwater, she sat by the main hearth, learning the fire's language, its size, its hisses, its hunger. The elders taught her that the flame was a gift from the sky spirits, a piece of the sun brought down to earth. But Alara knew it was something more primal. It was a beast, beautiful and dangerous, and it fell to her to keep it tamed. The responsibility was a heavy cloak on her small shoulders. At night she slept beside the central fire pit, her dreams filled not with childhood fantasies, but with the terror of a world plunged into darkness. She would wake with a start, her heart pounding, convinced the flame had died. Her small hands would rush to the clay pot, feeling for the familiar warmth, her breath catching in her throat until she saw the faint, reassuring glow. The tribe saw her as a symbol, a vessel of their enduring spirit. But inside she was just a child, terrified of failure, haunted by the weight of their collective hope. She was their fragile promise in brutal, unforgiving times. One evening, a gust of wind, heavy with the scent of rain and decay, swept through the camp, making the central fire sputter and shrink. The people flinched, a collective gasp of fear rippling through them. But Alara did not hesitate. She moved with a practiced grace, shielding the flames with her own small body, her face illuminated by the flickering light. In that moment, she was not a child. She was a guardian, a warrior armed not with stone, but with devotion. As she coaxed the fire back to a steady, defiant roar, the tribe watched in silence. They saw the flickering light reflected in her determined eyes and understood. Their survival was not in the strength of their hunters, but in the steady hands of this one small girl, who carried their future in a pot of clay and ash. ****. The river had always been a lifeline, a frozen highway for the hunters, and a solid floor for the children's games. Now it had become a thing of menace. The cracks began as fine, silvery lines like veins spreading across a dying body. But soon they widened into dark, jagged wounds that hissed and groaned. The ice was no longer silent. It whispered of the danger churning beneath its surface, a language of pops and groans that spoke of immense pressure and imminent collapse. The earth itself seemed to be stirring from a long slumber, and its first waking breaths were threatening to shatter their world. Two hunters, brothers named Tarek and Ren, stood at the river's edge, their spears held low. They had come to check their snares, a task they had performed countless times. But today they hesitated. The air vibrated with a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from the very depths of the water. It was a sound that resonated not in the ears but in the bones, a deep, guttural thrumming that felt ancient and wrong. Tarek, the elder, pressed his palm against the ice. It was cold, but it was also alive, trembling with a hidden power. "The river is angry," Ren murmured, his voice barely audible over the unsettling noise. Tarek didn't answer. He was listening to the whispers, trying to decipher their warning. That night, no one slept soundly. The strange sounds from the river grew louder, echoing through the valley like the slow, rhythmic drumming of a giant's heart. It was a constant, unnerving presence that frayed their nerves and fueled their growing dread. The shaman, an old man with eyes clouded by visions, sat hunched over the fire, rocking back and forth, his lips moving in a silent chant. He was trying to listen to the spirits of the land, but their voices were drowned out by the planet's restless groaning. He felt it not as a sound, but as a shift in the very fabric of existence. The world was tilting, and they were sliding towards its edge. The next morning, a section of the riverbank the size of their entire camp collapsed into the churning water with a deafening roar. The ice did not just break. It imploded, dragged down into a vortex of dark, swirling currents. The tribe watched in stunned silence as the place, where they had fished and drawn water for generations, was devoured by the river. The whispers had ceased. The earth was no longer murmuring its warnings. It was beginning to scream. The ground beneath them was no longer a dependable foundation. It was a fragile crust, and something immense and terrible was breaking through from below. The fear was no longer a distant threat. It was a physical presence, a cold dread that seeped into their bones, promising that the worst was yet to come. Hunger was a hollow drum beating in the belly of the tribe. The smaller game had vanished, and the fish were lost to the treacherous, churning river. There was only one hope left, a final, desperate gamble: the great mammoth. A scout returned. At dusk, breathless, his words tumbling out in a torrent of exhaustion and excitement. He had seen it, a lone bull, old and massive, separated from its herd, grazing in a high valley where the snows had melted to reveal patches of tough, brown grass. It was a suicidal undertaking, a battle against a living mountain of muscle and fury, but starvation left them no choice. To refuse the challenge was to accept a slow, quiet death. Kael, the elder, knew the risks. He had led such hunts in his youth, and he carried the scars to prove it. He remembered the screams of men crushed underfoot, the splintering of spears against thick, shaggy hide. But he also remembered the triumph, the life-giving feast that followed. He gathered the strongest of the remaining hunters, a group of 8 men whose faces were grim masks of determination. Among them were his own sons, Tarek and Ren, their youthful confidence now tempered by the fear they saw in their father's eyes. There were no grand speeches, no boasts of bravery. There was only a silent understanding, a shared acknowledgement that some of them would not return. They sharpened their flint-tipped spears, their movements economical and precise, the scraping of stone against wood the only sound in the tense, expectant air. They tracked the beast for a day and a night, moving through a landscape of sucking mud and treacherous half-frozen streams. The world was a graveyard of the dying ice age, and they were ghosts moving through it. They found the mammoth at dawn, its colossal form a dark silhouette against the pale, gray light. It was magnificent and terrible, its long, curved tusks yellowed with age, its shaggy coat matted with mud. The plan was simple, born of ancient tradition. They would drive it towards a cliff edge, a place where its size and power would become its own undoing. The hunt began not with a roar, but with a whisper. The men fanned out, becoming shadows in the mist, their hearts pounding a frantic rhythm against their ribs. The first spear was a signal. It struck the mammoth's flank, and the beast bellowed, a sound of rage and pain that shook the very air. The hunt descended into chaos. The men were ants trying to steer a mountain, their shouts swallowed by the creature's furious trumpeting. The ground trembled as it charged, its massive feet churning the mud into a deadly quagmire. One hunter, too slow to dodge, was caught by a sweeping tusk and thrown through the air like a broken doll. He landed with a sickening crunch, his body still. There was no time to mourn. Tarek, seeing his father stumble in the mud, threw his spear with desperate force, drawing the beast's attention. The mammoth turned, its small, hate-filled eyes fixing on him. It charged again, a relentless engine of destruction. They managed to turn it, to funnel its rage towards the cliff. But the victory was drenched in blood. Another man was trampled, his screams abruptly silenced. The ground at the cliff's edge, already weakened by the thaw, began to crumble under the mammoth's immense weight. For a moment, the great beast teetered on the brink, its roars turning from rage to terror. Then, with a final earth-shattering groan, the ledge gave way. The mammoth fell, its colossal body tumbling into the chasm below. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound. 4 men had died. The survivors, caked in mud and blood, did not celebrate. They stood, gasping for breath, looking at the bodies of their fallen brothers. They had won the food they so desperately needed, but the cost was devastating. The tribe had grown smaller, weaker, and the shadow of extinction now loomed larger than ever before. The meat from the mammoth hunt filled their bellies, but it could not quiet the fear in their hearts. The grief for the lost hunters was a raw, open wound and anew. More insidious terror began to creep in, not from the cracking ice or the hungry plains, but from the world of sleep. It started with the shaman. His name was Morwen, and his face, already a roadmap of wrinkles and age, became etched with a deeper, more profound horror. He no longer slept. He convulsed by the fire, his body racked with visions, his hands clawing at the empty air, as if trying to keep his head above water. In his dreams, the world was not cold. It was wet. He saw endless, gray water swallowing the land, covering the hunting grounds, the sacred caves, even the highest hills. He saw the faces of his people, their mouths open in silent screams as the waves closed over them. He felt the crushing weight of the ocean, the burning salt in his lungs, the absolute, final darkness of drowning. He would awaken with a choked gasp, his throat raw from unspoken screams, his body drenched in a cold sweat that felt chillingly like the water from his nightmares. The dreams were not fragmented or confusing. They were relentlessly, terrifyingly clear. They were not memories of the past, but glimpses of a future that was rushing towards them. The tribe watched him with a mixture of pity and fear. His nightly terrors became a ritual of their own. The children would press closer to their mothers, and the warriors would grip their spears as if they could fight the phantoms that haunted their spiritual leader. Morwen grew gaunt, his eyes wide and unfocused, seeing things in the flickering firelight that no one else could. He stopped speaking of spirits and ancestors. His language became one of water, of tides, and of a doom that came not from the sky, but from the vast, unknown expanse that lay beyond the horizon. He would trace lines in the dirt with a trembling finger, showing them how the water would come, not as a river overflowing its banks, but as a blanket rising silently and inexorably to claim everything. One evening, as the last light of the sun bled from the sky, Morwen stood before the tribe, his body frail but his voice ringing with a terrible certainty. He was no longer the gentle mystic who guided their rituals. He was a prophet of despair. "The sky will not save us," he croaked, his voice raspy and broken. He pointed a trembling hand towards the east, towards a horizon they had never seen. "The Great Mother, the sea, is waking. She is coming to reclaim her children." He paused, his gaze sweeping over their confused and frightened faces. "The sky will fall," he whispered, his voice dropping to a chilling hush, "and the sea will rise." His words hung in the damp air, a prophecy that felt colder and more final than any. Winter. They had survived the ice. But a new enemy was coming, an enemy they could not fight, an enemy that filled their shaman's dreams with the inescapable horror of drowning. The world was becoming a swamp. Where solid, frozen earth had once provided a firm foundation, there was now only a treacherous expanse of mud, pocked with stagnant pools of brown water. The melt was no longer a distant roar from the glacier. It was a creeping, silent invasion that turned their campsite into an island of damp misery. The familiar crunch of snow underfoot was replaced by the sickening squelch of mud, a constant reminder of the solid ground they had lost. The land itself felt diseased, its icy skin peeled back to reveal a soft, rotting underbelly. It was Ren, his eyes always sharp, who saw them first. He had ventured farther than usual, searching for dry firewood, a task that had become a daily struggle. There, pressed deep into a patch of newly exposed earth, were footprints. They were not from his tribe. The shape was subtly different, the stride longer, more confident. They were fresh, the edges still sharp, the water not yet having seeped in to blur them. He crouched, his hand hovering over one of the impressions, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. These were not the tracks of a lost wanderer. It was a group, moving with purpose, their path cutting directly across what his people had always considered their territory. He did not speak of it at first. He returned to the camp with his meager bundle of damp wood, the image of the footprints burned into his mind. The presence of another tribe was not just a surprise, it was a threat. Resources were already impossibly scarce. The mammoth was gone, and the land could barely support one tribe, let alone two. Competition meant conflict, and conflict meant death. That night, as he sat by the fire, he watched the faces of his people, the hungry children, the grieving widows, the weary hunters. The thought of another group, strong and unwounded, laying claim to their dwindling world was a terror that surpassed even the rising water. The next day, he took his brother Tarek to the spot. Tarek saw the prince, and his face hardened into a mask of grim resolve. There was no need for words. They both understood the implication. These were not the tracks of friends. They were the silent, unwelcome announcement of a coming war, a war for the last patches of solid ground, for the last of the game, for the very right to exist. They followed the trail for a short distance, their movements cautious, their spears held ready. The tracks led towards the high ground, the very place Kael had spoken of as a potential refuge from the encroaching water. The strangers were not just passing through. They were scouting, claiming the safest land for themselves. The discovery cast a new, more immediate shadow over the tribe. The abstract fear of the rising sea was suddenly replaced by the tangible threat of human enemies. Every snap of a twig, every shadow that moved at the edge of the firelight became a potential foe. The men began to take turns on watch, their eyes scanning the murky landscape not for prey, but for predators of their own kind. The footprints in the mud were an unspoken declaration. A line had been drawn in the wet, yielding earth. The struggle for survival was no longer just against a changing world. It was now a struggle against each other. And in a land that was shrinking by the day, there would not be room for them all. Asterisk, asterisk, he appeared at dusk, a lone figure stumbling out of the gray, misty twilight. He was not a warrior, nor a hunter. He was a ghost, a man hollowed out by a sorrow so profound it seemed to be the only thing holding his bones together. He walked with a shuffling, aimless gait, his clothes strange, unfamiliar hides soaked through and caked with dark, saline mud. He carried no spear, no tools, only a vacant, staring emptiness. The sentries, Tarek and Wren, raised their spears, their warning shouts dying in their throats as the man drew closer. This was no enemy. This was a man who had already been defeated. They brought him to the fire, and the tribe gathered, their fear of outsiders momentarily eclipsed by a morbid curiosity. The man collapsed onto the wet ground, his body trembling with exhaustion and a cold that seemed to emanate from within. He was young, yet his face was ancient, carved with the lines of an unspeakable trauma. But it was his eyes that held the true horror. They were wide and unfocused, reflecting the firelight but seeing something else entirely, a landscape of death that only he could perceive. They were the eyes of a man who had watched his entire world drown. Ilara, the firekeeper, brought him a piece of roasted meat. He looked at it without recognition, his hands not moving to take it. Kael, the elder, knelt before him, speaking in the old tongue, the common language of the plains. "Where do you come from?" Kael asked, his voice gentle. The stranger's gaze slowly, painfully shifted to meet Kael's, his lips parted, and a dry, rasping sound emerged, the first word he had likely spoken in days. "Water," he whispered, the word a death rattle. The water came. Slowly, in broken phrases punctuated by long, haunted silences, his story seeped out, poisoning the air around the fire. He spoke of a valley to the south, a place of rich hunting, and gentle slopes, a place where his people had lived for generations. He described the water's arrival not as a flood, but as a quiet, relentless tide that simply never receded. It filled their valley like a bowl, swallowing their homes, their sacred sites, their people. He spoke of the screams, of the desperate scramble for high ground, of watching his family, his mate, his children pulled away by a current that had the strength of 100 mammoths. He was the only one who had survived, clinging to a floating log for days, drifting on a vast, new sea that had once been his home. As he spoke, the tribe listened in absolute, horrified silence. The shaman's abstract prophecies, the whispers in the ice, the creeping dampness, it was all suddenly real, given a human face. The stranger from the south was not just a man. He was a messenger, a living testament to the doom Morwen had foretold. His eyes, which had witnessed the end, were a mirror reflecting their own potential fate. He had come from a drowned valley, and his very presence was a warning that their own valley was next. The memory of death he carried in his eyes was now a seed of terror planted in their own hearts, a seed that would grow in the darkness of the coming nights. Asterisk, asterisk. The stranger's story hung over the camp like a shroud, a constant unspoken dread. The world, already gray and grim, seemed to darken further. The children, sensing the adults' fear, played closer to the fire, their laughter muted and infrequent. They had been warned away from the roaring river, but the land itself had become a treacherous water world. Puddles grew into ponds, and streams appeared where none had been before, cutting new, unpredictable paths through the mud. It was in one of these new, deceptive pools that the tragedy struck. He was a small boy named Nari, full of a restless energy that not even the gloom could extinguish. He was chasing a frog, his bare feet splashing through the shallow water at the edge of the camp, his squeals of delight a fleeting, fragile sound in the oppressive quiet. His mother, distracted for only a moment by the mending of a torn hide, looked up to see him venture too close to a place where the ground sloped steeply into a deep, murky pool of meltwater. She opened her mouth to call him back, the warning. forming on her lips. But it was too late. It was not a wave, not a roar, but a silent, hungry surge. A pulse of water, displaced by a distant icefall or a shift in the unseen currents, swelled up the bank with astonishing speed. It was a quiet, liquid hand that reached out, lifted the boy from his feet, and pulled him under. There was no scream, only a brief splash and then a sudden, shocking stillness. The frog hopped away into the reeds. The mother's cry was a blade of sound, slicing through the camp stupor. Hunters dropped their tools and ran, plunging into the frigid water, their hands searching blindly in the cold, brown depths. It was Tarek who found him. He pulled the small, limp body from the water, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. The boy was still, his eyes open and staring at a sky he could no longer see. There was no mark on him, no sign of violence. He looked merely asleep. But the life, the restless energy, was gone, stolen by the silent water. The tribe gathered around the small body, a circle of stunned grief. The stranger from the south turned his face away, his body shaking, forced to witness the echo of his own loss. This was not a death they understood. It was not the honorable end of a hunter, nor the peaceful passing of an elder. It was a theft, a quiet, casual act of cruelty by a world that was becoming increasingly hostile. They buried him on a small rise, the only patch of ground that wasn't completely saturated. The earth was heavy and wet, the digging a slow, miserable struggle against the clinging mud. They wrapped his body in a soft hide and placed his favorite carving, a small, smooth stone shaped like a bird, in his hand. As they covered him with the soaked earth, a profound and terrifying uncertainty settled over them. They did not know what had killed him. Was it the river's anger, a malevolent spirit? Or was it simply the land itself, now so saturated with water that it had begun to breathe it, to claim life with it? They stood over the small, muddy mound, a tribe united in sorrow, and for the first time they felt truly helpless. They knew how to fight beasts and men, but they did not know how to fight the water that could steal a child in silence. Asterisk desperation drove them back to the old ways. With the land turning against them and the future a terrifying unknown, they sought comfort and control in the familiar cadences of ritual. Morwen, the shaman, though weakened by his visions and the tribe's first drowning, knew he had to act. He gathered the elders at the base of the great rock that sheltered their camp, the place where their ancestors had painted symbols of successful hunts and fertile seasons. He would perform the rite of appeasement, a ceremony ancient even to them, designed to soothe the spirits of the earth and sky and restore balance to the world. They prepared for 3 days. The hunters brought what little they had, a scrawny fox, a handful of birds as offerings. The women gathered the sacred herbs, their leaves now limp and darkened by the constant damp. Ilara, the firekeeper, carefully nurtured a special flame, feeding it with the driest pieces of wood they possessed. There was a solemn purpose to their movements, a desperate hope that if they performed the ritual perfectly, with the correct chants and the proper sacrifices, the world would right itself. The water would recede, the sun would warm them without malice, and the ground would become solid once more. It was a bargain they were trying to strike with gods who had seemingly abandoned them. The ceremony began at twilight. Morwen, his face painted with white clay, stood before the sacred rock, his voice a low, chanting drone that rose and fell with the rhythm of a handheld drum. He called to the spirit of the glacier, the great father of the ice. He called to the spirit of the earth, the mother who sustained them. He recounted the deeds of their ancestors, their respect for the land, their adherence to the ancient laws. The tribe stood behind him, a huddled mass of hope and fear, their voices joining his in the chorus, a plea sent up into the darkening, indifferent sky. The smoke from the sacred fire, heavy with the scent of burning herbs, did not rise. It clung to the ground, a thick, choking fog that mirrored the gloom in their hearts, but the world did not listen. As Morwen reached the climax of the ritual, his voice rising to a desperate cry, a low rumble echoed from the valley, not of thunder, but of shifting, collapsing earth. A section of the glacier, miles away but immense in size, broke free with a deafening crack. The ground beneath their feet trembled violently, and the sacred offerings laid before the rock slid into the mud. The fire sputtered as a sudden, cold rain began to fall, not a cleansing rain, but a hard, driving downpour that hissed as it struck the flames. The ritual was broken. The connection was severed. A collective gasp of despair rippled through the tribe. The gods were not angry, they were absent. The ancient rites, the chants that had given them comfort and a sense of control for generations, were now just empty words, powerless against the raw, elemental forces reshaping their world. Morwen fell to his knees, the drum slipping from his grasp. The white paint on his face streaked and ran in the rain like tears of clay. He looked at his people, at their faces illuminated by the dying, hissing fire, and he saw not just fear, but the terrifying dawn of a new awareness. The old magic was dead. The spirits were silent. Panic, cold and sharp, began to set in. They were utterly, terrifyingly alone. Asterisk, asterisk, the failure of the ritual shattered their last vestiges of hope in the old world. There was no appeasing the spirits. There was only survival. Kael, the tribe's elder, knew that faith could no longer guide them. Only a decision, hard and brutal, could save what was left of his people. He called the Council of Bones. It was not a formal gathering of chiefs, but a somber assembly of the tribe's most experienced survivors, the remaining hunters, the oldest mothers, and Morwen, the shaman, his spiritual authority now replaced by the grim wisdom of his terrifying visions. They met in the heart of the camp, huddled close to the fire, their faces grim, the weight of their people's future pressing down on them. The air was thick with unspoken grief and a tension that was almost unbearable. The question before them was simple in its wording, but monumental in its consequence: flee or fight. But how could they fight a rising sea? How could they battle the very ground dissolving beneath their feet? Tarek, his face still etched with the memory of the drowned boy and the lost hunters, spoke first, his voice rough with anger. "Fight what?" he demanded, his gaze sweeping across the council. "The rain? The mud? We are fighting ghosts." "We should have left weeks ago. We must go to the high ground now, before the path is lost." His words were met with fierce opposition. An old woman named Lara, who had seen more winters than anyone save Kael, struck the ground with her walking stick. "Flee to where?" she countered, her voice raspy but strong. "The high ground is unknown. The tracks of the others are there. We would be trading a slow death by water for a quick one by their spears. This is our home. Our ancestors are buried here. To leave is to let our spirits die, even if our bodies live." Her words resonated with the deep, primal fear of leaving the familiar, of abandoning the bones of their kin to the encroaching water. To run was to sever their roots, to become adrift in a hostile world. The debate raged, a fire of fear and desperation. They argued over dwindling food supplies, the unknown dangers of the highlands, the omen of the stranger from the south, and the fresh tracks in the mud. Every option was a path to a different kind of death. To stay meant drowning. To leave meant facing starvation and a violent, unseen enemy. Morwen, the shaman, sat in silence for most of the council, his eyes closed, listening not to their words but to the echoes of his nightmares. Finally, Kael turned to him. "You have seen what is to come, old friend. What do your visions tell us?" Morwen opened his eyes, and the haunted, distant look was gone. In its place was a chilling clarity. "My visions do not show us a choice," he said, his voice low and steady, cutting through the arguments. "They show only water. It will cover this valley. It will cover the place where we buried the boy. It will climb the rocks where our ancestors painted. There is no here to defend." He looked directly at Lyra. "The bones of our ancestors will be washed away whether we stay or go. The only question is whether we will be washed away with them." His words fell like stones into a silent pool. The debate was over. The horrifying truth settled upon them all. They were not deciding whether to flee or fight. The fight was already lost. They were deciding only whether to live or to die. The council's decision was made, but it was a fragile, bitter consensus. They would leave at dawn, a grim exodus towards the unknown highlands. The plan was whispered through the camp, a death sentence for their way of life, for their home. While most accepted the verdict with a heavy, resigned dread, for one family it was a truth they could not bear. It was a man named Jorn, a hunter who had always been ambitious and resentful of Kael's leadership, who saw the tribe's collective decision not as a path to survival, but as a shared march towards death at the hands of the other tribe. He believed their only chance was to move faster, to travel lighter, and to be unburdened by the slow and the weak. That night, as a cold, persistent drizzle fell from the sky, muffling all sound, the betrayal unfolded in silence. Jorn, his mate, and their 2 adolescent sons moved like shadows through the sleeping camp. They did not just leave, they stole. Their hands, quick and practiced in the darkness, took the best of the dried mammoth meat, the sharpest flint spearheads, and 3 of the warmest fur cloaks. They were not just ensuring their own survival, they were actively crippling the people they were leaving behind. The final, most devastating act was the theft of fire. Jorn's mate, with a heart as cold as the river water, crept towards the central hearth where Ilara slept. She scooped a portion of the precious, glowing embers into a prepared clay pot. A second, stolen heart of the tribe, Ilara stirred in her sleep, a flicker of unease disturbing her dreams. She felt a subtle shift in the air, a momentary coldness as the stolen embers were carried away into the night. She awoke with a start, her hand immediately going to her own pot, relieved to feel its familiar warmth. But her eyes, now accustomed to the gloom, saw movement at the edge of the camp. She saw 4 figures, laden with supplies, slipping away into the darkness. She saw the faint, telltale glow of a second firepot. The truth struck her with the force of a physical blow. It was not just a theft of food and tools. It was a schism, a tearing of the very fabric of their people. She wanted to scream, to raise the alarm, but a cold, paralyzing fear gripped her. To shout would be to admit the unthinkable, that their unity, their loyalty, the very bonds that made them a tribe, had fractured under the weight of fear. Survival had become a selfish, solitary pursuit. The family vanished into the rain-soaked darkness, their departure leaving a wound in the heart of the camp that was deeper and more painful than any left by the rising water. When the theft was discovered at dawn, the rage and grief were profound. They had lost more than supplies. They had lost trust. The world was not just trying to drown them. It was turning them against each other, proving that the greatest threat was not the flood, but the darkness that lurked within the human heart. Loyalty had drowned in the night. The betrayal left them wounded and demoralized. But there was no time to dwell on the treachery. They had to move. Their departure was a frantic, miserable affair, a flight from a home that was already being consumed. As they began their ascent from the valley floor, the sky, which had been a constant, weeping gray, turned a bruised, sickly yellow. The rain did not stop. It changed. It grew heavier, thicker, and it began to carry the sharp, stinging scent of the sea. The water that fell from the sky was no longer fresh. It was briny, tasting of a vast, distant ocean they had only ever heard of in the shaman's terrifying prophecies. The world became a disorienting nightmare. A violent wind rose from the east, a direction from which the wind never blew, carrying with it not just the salt spray, but a fine, gritty powder that stung their eyes and coated their tongues. It was ash. Somewhere, far beyond the horizon, a mountain had exploded, spewing its guts into the upper air. The salt-laced rain mixed with the falling ash, creating a thick, abrasive mud that fell in sheets, plastering their hair to their faces, and their clothes to their bodies. The sky was no longer just a source of water. It was an enemy, actively assaulting them, trying to scour them from the face of the earth. Lightning, unlike any they had ever seen, began to tear through the yellowed sky. It was not the clean, sharp crack of a summer storm, but a series of furious, jagged slashes that seemed to rip the heavens apart. One bolt struck a stand of ancient, withered pines on the ridge above them. The trees, already dead from the changing climate, exploded into flame, but the fire was unnatural. The salt in the rain and the minerals in the ash caused the flames to burn with an eerie Greenish-blue light, a spectral fire that offered no warmth, only a terrifying, ghostly illumination. The forest was burning in a storm, a paradox that defied all logic and reason. They huddled together under a rock outcropping, a miserable, shivering mass of humanity as the world raged around them. The salt water, which now poured from the hillsides, in muddy torrents, was a confirmation of their worst fears. The sea was not just rising, it was being carried inland by the storm, a full-scale invasion. The shaman Morwen stared out into the maelstrom, his face unreadable. This was worse than his dreams. His visions had shown him a quiet, inexorable rising, but this was a violent, chaotic assault. This was the death of a world, not in a slow, creeping flood, but in a furious tempest of fire, ash, and salt. There was no shelter, no safety. The very air had become a weapon, and as they watched the hillsides burn under a rain of salt water, they understood that they were caught between two apocalypses, the drowning of the land and the burning of the sky. In the gray, ashen light that followed the storm, the full extent of their desperation became clear. The mammoth meat was nearly gone, and the stolen supplies had left them perilously close to starvation. The land around them, scarred by the fire and soaked in salt, offered nothing. Kael knew that to continue their climb without sustenance was to condemn them all to a slow, walking death. He made a decision that felt like a prayer and a death sentence in one. He would send out a scouting party not to find a new home, but simply to find anything edible, a single beast, a patch of edible roots, anything to fuel their flight. Tarek and Ren, his sons, were the first to volunteer. Their faces were thin and drawn, but their eyes still held a flicker of the hunter's fire. Two other men, the last of their seasoned hunters, joined them. The four of them were the tribe's last hope, their final cast of the spear into a world that had grown barren and hostile. Kael watched them go, his heart a cold stone in his chest. He gave them no words of encouragement, no false promises of success. His gaze was enough. It conveyed the crushing weight of his reliance on them, a burden heavier than any spear or pack. The four men disappeared into the mist-shrouded, ash-covered landscape, their forms swallowed by the gray silence. The tribe waited. The hours stretched into an eternity of gnawing hunger and listening. Every gust of wind in the skeletal trees sounded like returning footsteps. Every distant cry of a bird was mistaken for a shout of triumph. The children were too weak to cry, their hunger a silent, accusing presence. The adults sat, conserving what little energy they had, their eyes fixed on the path where the hunters had vanished. Hope, already a scarce commodity, began to wither and die as the day wore on, and the sky began to darken once more. It was Ilara, the firekeeper, who found the first sign. She had wandered a short distance from the camp, searching for anything that might burn, when she saw it floating in a large pool of brackish, stagnant water. It was a hunter's pelt, one of the thick furs they wore for warmth, its leather darkened by the water. Her breath caught in her throat. A few feet away, another object bobbed against a fallen log. It was a spear, its shaft broken, its flint tip missing. A cold dread, absolute and suffocating, enveloped her. She ran back to the camp, her cries ragged and breathless. Kael and the others followed her back to the pool. The scene was a quiet, brutal testament to what had happened. There were no bodies, no signs of a struggle in the mud. There was only the evidence floating gently in the still, dark water. The pelts, a broken spear, and something else, a dark, swirling cloud in the water that could only be blood. The hunters had not been taken by the flood. They had met the other tribe. The silent footprints in the mud had finally been given a voice, and it was a voice of violence and death. The scouting party had not just failed. They had been erased. And as the tribe stared at the blood-stained pelts floating downstream, they knew that the high ground they were fleeing to was not a sanctuary. It was a hunting ground, and they were the prey, asterisk. The loss of the hunters was a final, crushing blow. The tribe was no longer just a group of survivors. They were a funeral procession, stumbling blindly towards a fate that seemed increasingly certain. Grief was a luxury they could not afford, yet it was a heavy cloak on every shoulder. Kael. Having lost both his sons in a single, silent, unseen clash seemed to age a lifetime in a day. His leadership was now a hollow thing, a duty he performed on instinct alone, his heart shattered. They continued their climb, driven by the simple, primal need to move, to put distance between themselves and the rising water, even if it meant walking into the arms of a different death. After another day of grueling travel through the ash-caked hills, they crested a ridge and saw it. The landscape fell away before them, and in the distance, under a sky the color of a fresh bruise, lay the sea. It was not the gentle, distant water of stories. It was a vast, angry, churning expanse of gray, stretching to a horizon that was lost in mist and spray. It had come so far inland, swallowing the coastal plains and licking at the feet of the hills. And between them and the water lay a new, terrifying coastline, a beach that had not existed a month ago. It was a shore littered not with shells and driftwood, but with death. As they drew closer, the full horror of the scene revealed itself. The beach was a graveyard. The immense, skeletal remains of whales lay half buried in the dark, wet sand, their bones picked clean by unseen scavengers. They were creatures of the deep, thrown miles inland by the fury of the storm, their presence a testament to the world-altering power of the flood. But the whales were not the only dead. Scattered among them, tangled in seaweed and debris, were the bodies of people. It was another tribe, caught unawares by the surging tide, their flight cut short. Men, women, children, their forms were twisted and broken, their skin pale and bloated. They were a silent, stark tableau of what happened to those who did not run fast enough. The tribe stood on the ridge, looking down at the dead shore, a profound, soul-shaking silence falling over them. This was the fate Morwen had dreamed of. This was the end the stranger from the south had described. To see it laid out before them, the sheer, indiscriminate scale of the destruction, was to understand their own insignificance in the face of it. They were nothing, a fleeting breath in a world that was being violently remade. The ocean was not just swallowing the land. It was cleansing it, wiping it clean of all life, leaving behind only bones and silence. Morwen walked to the edge of the ridge and pointed a trembling finger towards the macabre scene. "That," he whispered, his voice cracking, "is the world that was." He turned to his small, terrified flock, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. "And that," he said, his gesture encompassing the churning, endless water, "is the world that is. There was no hope to be found in the sight, no lesson to be learned other than the finality of the flood?" The dead shore was a mirror, showing them not just the corpses of another tribe, but the reflection of their own imminent end. The ocean was swallowing the land, and it would not stop until it had swallowed them all. Fear finally gave them strength. The sight of the dead shore broke them from their stupor of grief and propelled them into a frantic search for shelter. They could not go down towards the water, and they dared not continue up into the hunting grounds of their enemies. They moved laterally along the ridge, a desperate, sideways scramble, their eyes scanning the rock faces for any sign of refuge. It was Lyra, the old woman, who found it. Her knowledge of the land, born from a lifetime of gathering herbs and roots, led them to a place the hunters had never known, a narrow fissure in the rock, almost completely hidden by a curtain of withered, salt-burned vines. The entrance was small, forcing them to crawl one by one into the darkness beyond. The air inside was cold and still, a stark contrast to the howling wind and ash-filled air outside. It smelled of damp stone and deep earth, a scent of stability in a world that had lost all meaning. Ilara, her hands trembling, brought the sacred fire inside. As she coaxed the embers into a small, flickering flame, the light pushed back the oppressive darkness, revealing the nature of their sanctuary. They were in a cave, but it was more than a simple hole in the rock. It was a cathedral of stone, a vast, echoing chamber that felt ancient and sacred, and it was not empty. As the firelight danced across the walls, it revealed them, handprints. Hundreds of them, stenciled in red and black ochre, covering the undulating surfaces of the cave. They were the marks of their ancestors, a silent, ghostly congregation that reached across a chasm of forgotten time. Each handprint was a life. A person who had stood in this very spot, pressing their palm against the cold stone, leaving a permanent echo of their existence. There were the large hands of hunters, the slender hands of women, and most poignantly, the tiny, perfect prints of children. It was a library of generations, a testament to a lineage so long they had forgotten its beginning. A profound, reverent silence fell over the tribe. They reached out, their own hands hovering over the ancient marks, not quite daring to touch them. It was as if they could feel the warmth, the life, still lingering in the stone. They were not the first to seek shelter here. They were part of a chain, a long, unbroken line of people who had faced their own struggles, their own fears within these same walls. The cave was not just a shelter. It was a womb, a place of memory and connection. For the first time since the thaw began, they felt a sense of belonging, a feeling that they were not just a lost and dying band, but the living descendants of those who had endured before. Kael walked to the deepest part of the cave, where a particularly large red handprint was placed high on the wall, a mark of leadership. He pressed his own palm against it, the cold stone seeping into his skin. He was not just an elder leading a broken tribe. He was a link in a chain, responsible for the hands that would come after his. Hiding in this sacred cave, surrounded by the ghosts of their ancestors, they found a flicker of something they thought they had lost forever, a reason to survive. They were not just fighting for their own lives, but for the memory of every handprint on the wall, for the forgotten people who had placed their trust in the future. The sanctuary of the cave was a temporary reprieve, a place of quiet where the horrors of the outside world were muted to a distant roar. In the flickering light of the sacred flame, huddled together for warmth against the deep subterranean chill, the tribe found themselves suspended between memory and extinction. It was in this timeless space that Lyra, the old woman, began to speak. Her voice, usually raspy and thin, took on a strange new resonance in the echoing chamber, a strength that seemed drawn from the ancient stones themselves. She was the last living vessel of the old stories, the oral traditions that had been passed down for generations, and she knew that if she did not speak them now, they would die with her. She did not speak of the flood or the enemy tribe. She spoke of a time before time, a world of profound, unending cold when the first people had no fire. She described the terror of the long, dark nights, the gnawing cold that stole the life from the weak, the fear of the great shadow beasts that hunted in the darkness. Her words painted a vivid picture of a desperate, huddled existence, a life lived at the mercy of a world without warmth. She spoke of the first fire not as a human invention, but as a gift, a piece of a falling star that had struck a dead tree, setting it ablaze. She told of the first hero, a woman who dared to approach the terrifying light, who conquered her fear to snatch a burning branch and bring it back to her people. As she spoke, the tribe listened, captivated. The children, their bellies empty, forgot their hunger, their eyes wide in the firelight. The adults, their hearts heavy with loss, felt a flicker of an emotion they had not felt in a long time: pride. Lyra's story was their story. The struggle she described was their own struggle, mirrored across a vast expanse of time. She spoke of gods made not of flesh, but of the elements themselves, a god of the biting wind, a god of the unyielding stone, a god of the life-giving sun. These were not the benevolent spirits Morwen had tried to appease. They were primal, indifferent forces, much like the ones they faced now. The story was a reminder that their ancestors had also lived on a knife's edge, that survival had always been a battle. Her tale reached its end as she described how the first firekeeper learned to feed the flame, to keep it alive, to pass it down through the generations. As she finished, her gaze fell upon Elara, who sat clutching her clay pot, the sacred flame pulsing within. A silent understanding passed between the oldest and the youngest of the tribe. The fire Elara guarded was not just a tool for warmth. It was a direct, unbroken link to that first stolen star fragment. It was their history, their identity, their soul, contained within a single, glowing ember. Having passed on the last of her knowledge, a profound peace seemed to settle over Lyra. Her duty was done. She lay back against the cold stone wall, her breathing growing shallow. The tribe watched in silence as the life slowly, gently faded from her. There was no struggle, no fear. It was a quiet, dignified end, a final merging with the ancestors, whose story she had just honored. She died as the last echo of her voice faded into the vast, stony silence of the cave. And in her passing, the tribe felt not just another loss, but the immense, crushing weight of the history that now rested solely on their shoulders. The death of Lyra felt like the closing of a great book. The last voice of their history was silenced, leaving them in a profound and unsettling quiet. They sealed her body in a small alcove in the cave, a final act of reverence, before turning to face the terrifying reality of their situation. The cave was a sanctuary, but it was also a prison. They had no food, and the world outside was a maelstrom of ash and salt water. But even the horrors they had witnessed could not have prepared them for what came next. The sky, which had been a sickly, bruised yellow, began to darken. It was not the darkness of twilight or an approaching storm. It was a thick, suffocating blackness that descended in the middle of the day, a celestial event that had no precedent in their history or their stories. The volcanic eruption, a distant, unseen catastrophe, had entered a new, more violent phase. It was now spewing so much ash and sulfur into the atmosphere that it was blotting out the sun itself. The faint light at the cave's entrance vanished, plunging them into a darkness so absolute that it felt solid, a physical weight pressing in on them from all sides. The only light left in their entire world was the small, defiant glow of Alara's sacred fire. Panic, primal and uncontrollable, ripped through the tribe. The darkness was a tangible monster, the embodiment of their deepest fears. Children began to scream, their cries echoing horribly in the vast black chamber. The adults stumbled and fell, disoriented and terrified, their hands outstretched, searching for a familiar touch, a solid wall, anything to anchor them in the suffocating void. The outside world, once a source of life, had become utterly alien. The constant roar of the sea and the wind was now joined by a new sound, a soft, persistent hissing, the sound of fine ash falling like a steady, dry rain burying the world. In a blanket of black dust, starvation, which had been a quiet, gnawing ache, now became a sharp, immediate agony. In the total darkness, there was no hope of foraging, no possibility of hunting. There was only waiting. The days and nights blurred into one long, unending period of blackness. They huddled together around Alara's fire, a small island of humanity, in an ocean of night. The fire, once a symbol of their spirit, was now their only reality. Its light was the only thing that kept the madness at bay, the only proof that they still existed. But even in the heart of this new apocalypse, a different primal force was at work. One of the women, a young mate of one of the lost hunters, had gone into labor. Her groans of pain cut through the darkness, a sound not of death but of life, struggling to be born into a world without a sun. The other women gathered around her, their faces illuminated by the firelight, their hands guiding and comforting her through the ordeal. In the midst of starvation and absolute darkness, as ash rained down from a black sky and the world outside was being remade by flood and fire, a new life was fighting its way into existence. It was a defiant, impossible act of hope in the face of utter despair. The birth was a brutal, primal struggle, a battle fought in a universe that had been reduced to a single point of flickering light. The mother's cries of agony echoed the screams of the dying world outside, yet they held a different meaning. They were the sound of creation, not destruction. The other women, their own faces gaunt with hunger, worked by the light of Alara's fire, their movements guided by an instinct as old as the handprints on the walls. They were midwives to a birth at the end of the world, their gentle murmurs a stark contrast to the howling wind and hissing ash at the cave's mouth. And then a new sound cut through the darkness, the thin, reedy wail of a newborn. It was a cry of shocking vitality, a sound of pure, unadulterated life that sliced through the oppressive gloom. A baby had been born. A boy. He was small and frail, his skin pale in the firelight, but he was alive, his tiny fists clenched as if in defiance of the black sky he had been born under. The mother, exhausted but radiant, held him to her chest, her tears tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. The tribe, which had been a huddled mass of fear, drew closer, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief. The child was a paradox. He was life born from death, hope born from despair. He was a promise that their line had not yet ended, that the chain reaching back to the first hands on the wall was not yet broken, in a world that had offered them nothing but loss. His arrival felt like a miracle, a sign not from the absent gods, but from the enduring, relentless spirit of life itself. He was a reason to fight, a future to protect, a tiny, fragile vessel for all their collective hopes. Kael, the elder, took the newborn in his arms, his weathered hands surprisingly gentle. He looked down at the infant's face, a face that knew nothing of the flood, the ash, the hunger, or the fear. He knew the child needed a name, one that would mark the incredible, terrifying circumstances of his birth. He would not be named for a great hunter or a strong beast. He would be named for the moment he arrived, a moment of profound darkness and impossible light. "We will call him Afterlight," Kael declared, his voice for the first time in a long time holding a note of strength. "For he has come after the light was taken from us. He is the light that comes after." The name settled over the tribe, a perfect encapsulation of their reality. The child Afterlight was not a promise that the sun would return. He was a promise that they could learn to live in the darkness. As ash continued to rain down from a black and starless sky, the tribe huddled around their new member, a tiny, crying symbol of their own stubborn refusal to vanish. His birth did not change their circumstances. They were still starving, still trapped, but it changed them. It gave them a future to fight for, a single precious reason to face the horrors that still awaited them outside the cave. The birth of Afterlight was a miracle, but miracles do not fill empty bellies. The cries of the newborn were a constant, painful reminder of their own gnawing hunger and the mother's desperate need for sustenance. The darkness persisted, a seemingly permanent state, but Kael knew they could not wait for the sun to return. To stay in the cave was to starve. He made a decision born of absolute desperation. They would attempt one final hunt, a blind foray into the black, ash-covered world. It was a suicidal mission, but the alternative, a slow, passive death in the dark, was no longer an option. 3 figures prepared to leave. Kael himself, his old body frail but his will unbroken. Morwen, the shaman whose visions had become their only map. And surprisingly, Ilara, the young firekeeper, refused to be left behind. She argued that her flame, their only source of light, was as crucial as any spear. A small, grim party of the old, the mystic, and the young would venture out to save them all. They carried no spears, only sharpened sticks and the desperate hope that the world outside was not entirely dead. They left the others huddled around a secondary fire, a small portion of the sacred flame, their faces etched with a fear that was deeper than any they had yet known. Stepping out of the cave was like stepping into a void. The blackness was total. The air thick with falling ash that choked the lungs and blinded the eyes. The ground was covered in a thick, soft blanket of it, silencing their footsteps, creating a world of eerie, muffled silence. Ilara held the firepot aloft, its small glow a pathetic but defiant pinprick of light in the infinite black. It cast a small, dancing circle of illumination around them, revealing a landscape transformed into a monochromatic nightmare. The world was shades of gray and black, a place of ghosts and shadows. They moved slowly, Morwen leading the way, his senses attuned to the subtle shifts in the land that he could feel through the solace of his feet. He was not looking for tracks. He was feeling for life, for any vibration that was not the wind or the sea. For hours they found nothing. The world was a sterile, ashen desert. Despair, cold and absolute, began to settle in. Their small flame seemed to shrink, its light swallowed by the oppressive darkness. And then they saw it. At the very edge of their circle of light, two eyes glowed back at them, a pair of faint, green embers in the black dot. It was a reindeer, a lone survivor, its coat matted with black ash, its body gaunt from starvation. It stared at them, too weak. Or too confused to run? For a moment, hunter and prey stood frozen in a tableau of mutual desperation. Then, the madness of hunger took over. Kael let out a hoarse cry, a sound that was more animal than human, and lunged forward. The hunt was a clumsy, pathetic, stumbling affair, a chase across a flooded, ash-covered plain. It was not a contest of skill or strength, but a raw, frantic scramble for life. The reindeer, weakened and disoriented, stumbled and fell. Before it could rise, they were upon it, their sharpened sticks rising and falling in a frenzy of desperation. The end was brutal, ugly, and swift. As they stood over the body of the fallen animal, panting in the black ashen air, they were not proud hunters. They were scavengers, survivors, their humanity stripped away by a hunger so profound it had bled into madness. ***. They dragged the carcass of the reindeer back to the cave, a hard-won, pathetic trophy. The meat, though stringy and sparse, was life. It silenced the cries of the newborn and brought a flicker of strength back to the limbs of the starving. For a brief, fleeting moment, huddled in their dark sanctuary, they allowed themselves a sliver of hope. They had survived the darkness. They had survived the hunger. Perhaps, they thought, the worst was over. But the world was not finished with them yet. As the black sky outside began to show the first faint signs of turning gray, a new sound reached them, a sound that dwarfed the wind and the hiss of the ash. It was a low, deep, resonant roar, a vibration that they felt not in their ears but in the very stone of the cave. Morwen was the first to understand. The haunted look returned to his eyes, a look of horrified recognition. "It is here," he whispered, his voice trembling. "The great wave, the one from my dreams." There was no time to question, no time to prepare. The roar grew louder, closer, a sound of impossible power, the sound of a moving ocean. Kael screamed the only order that mattered. "Climb, to the back of the cave." "Climb!" Panic erupted, a frantic scramble for life in the flickering firelight. They abandoned the remains of the reindeer, the precious fire, everything. They scrambled deeper into the cave, their hands and feet searching for purchase on the rough, sloping walls, trying to climb as high as they could towards the dark, unseen ceiling. The sea arrived not as a gentle tide, but as a battering ram. A solid wall of water, a tidal surge of unimaginable force, smashed into the mouth of the cave. The sound was a deafening, explosive boom, as if the mountain itself had cracked in two. The water surged into the chamber, a churning, violent torrent, filled with rocks, trees, and the debris of a shattered world. It was not a flood, it was an explosion of water. The sacred fire they had left behind was extinguished in an instant, plunging them into a terrifying, roaring darkness. The water rose with terrifying speed, a black, frigid tide that clawed at their heels as they climbed. The screams of the terrified were swallowed by the roar of the deluge. One of the older men lost his footing, his cry cut short as he was swept away into the churning chaos below. The mother of the newborn afterlight held her baby high above her head, her body pressed against the rock, trying to shield him from the spray. Ilara, who had guarded the flame for so long, now clung to the rock, the empty, cold pot still clutched. In her hand, a useless relic of a world that no longer existed. There was no warning, there was no escape. The tribe, which had survived the ice, the hunger, and the darkness, was now being drowned in its final sanctuary. They could only climb, their fingers bleeding on the sharp rock, as the sea in its final, ultimate victory arrived to claim them. The darkness was absolute, a roaring, liquid chaos. The world was no longer air and earth, but a churning vortex of water and sound. The tribe, scattered and clinging to the high walls of the cave, was immersed in a nightmare made real. The water did not just rise. It fought them, its powerful currents trying to rip them from their precarious holds. The screams were the worst part. They were not the shouts of battle, but the raw, primal cries of pure terror, of people being torn from their families, from life itself. A child's panicked shriek was abruptly silenced. A woman's desperate call to her mate was answered only by the thunderous roar of the water in the blackness. Touch was the only sense that mattered. People clung to each other, their grips slipping on wet skin and soaked hides. A hand would lose its purchase, and a body would be swept away into the churning abyss below, their departure marked only by a brief, desperate cry that was instantly swallowed by the deluge. The makeshift tents of hide they had erected, their last semblance of home, collapsed and were swept away like leaves in a storm. The carefully stored tools, the bones of their ancestors they had tried to save, everything was devoured by the flood. The drowning was total and indiscriminate, violent erasure of their existence. Kael felt the water clawing at his legs, its icy grip shockingly strong. He held on, his old muscles screaming in protest, his face pressed against the cold, wet stone. He could hear the panicked cries of his people, and the sound was a physical pain, a spear twisting in his gut. He was their elder, their leader, and he was utterly powerless. He could not command the sea. He could not fight the tide. He could only hold on and listen to his tribe die. The water was filled with debris-splintered logs, sharp rocks that turned the churning water into a deadly grinder. Battering their already weakened bodies, the mother of Afterlight was a fierce, primal force in the darkness. She had wedged herself into a narrow crevice, her body shielding the infant from the main force of the current. The water surged around her, trying to tear the baby from her arms, but she held on with a strength born of pure maternal desperation. She could feel the life of her child against her, a tiny, warm presence in the cold, liquid hell. She would not let him go. She would be his anchor, his shield, or she would be his tomb. Time lost all meaning. The roaring darkness was an eternity. The struggle was no longer for survival, but for one more breath, one more second of holding on. The water reached its peak, a terrifying moment of stillness in the heart of the chaos, before it began slowly, grudgingly to recede, but the damage was done. The cave, their final sanctuary, had become a tomb. As the water level dropped, it left behind a scene of unimaginable devastation, a silence that was more horrifying than the roar that had preceded it. The flood had been total, and the tribe had been broken. The water receded, leaving behind a thick, foul-smelling sludge and a silence that was heavy with loss. The survivors, coated in mud and shivering with a cold that went deeper than bone, slowly, painfully, made their way down from the high ledges of the cave. In the faint, gray light that now filtered in from the entrance, they saw the devastation. The cave was empty, scoured clean by the flood. Of the dozens who had sought shelter, only a handful remained. They stumbled out into the open air, their movements stiff and robotic, their eyes hollow with shock. The world outside was unrecognizable. The sky was no longer black, but a uniform, oppressive gray. The land was a vast, silent swamp, with the sea stretching out almost to the foot of their ridge. They had survived, but they had survived into a world that was alien and empty. They gathered on the highest point of the ridge, a small, windswept hill that had become the last island of solid ground in their world. They huddled together, a pathetic, broken remnant of a once proud tribe. They took account, 17 of all the people who had faced the last winter. Only 17 souls were left. There was no great cry of grief, no wailing. The loss was too immense, too absolute for tears. It was a silent, internal devastation that left them numb. Kael, his face a mask of stone, looked at the faces of the survivors, the young mother clutching Afterlight who had miraculously survived the deluge. Ilara, the firekeeper, her purpose now extinguished, a few other women and children, and only 2 men besides himself. All the others, his sons, the hunters, the elders, the families were gone, claimed by the water. It was Kael who began the ritual. He picked up a sharp piece of flint, its edge honed by the churning water. He walked to a large, flat-faced boulder that stood at the peak of the hill, a silent sentinel overlooking the new, vast sea. With slow, deliberate movements, he began to scratch a mark into the stone. It was not a picture of a beast or a symbol of a spirit. It was a simple, straight line, one mark for each person lost. He carved a line for Tarek, another for Ren, another for Lyra. He carved and carved, his arm aching, his mind a numb void, until a cluster of lines scarred the face of the rock, a silent, brutal accounting of their dead. The others watched, and then, one by one, they came forward. They took the flint and added their own marks, their own memories. A woman carved a small circle for the child she had lost. A man carved a jagged line for his brother. They were not just carving lines. They were carving names, faces, voices into the stone. The boulder became a tombstone for their entire tribe, a monument to the drowned. When they were finished, they stood before the stone, their hands red and raw, and looked at the crude, heartbreaking record of their loss. They were the hill of names, the last living memory of all those who now lay silent beneath the water. The days that followed were a blur of gray emptiness. The 17 survivors existed in a state of shock, huddled on their lonely hill, the stone of names a constant, silent accusation. They had no tools, no shelter, and most devastatingly, no fire. The cold was a relentless enemy, seeping into their bones, making their wet clothes a prison of ice. The nights were a terrifying ordeal of shivering in the absolute darkness, the memory of the roaring water still fresh in their minds. They were alive, but they were not living. They were waiting to die, the last embers of their own spirits fading into the cold, damp air. Ilara felt the loss of the fire as a physical amputation. For her entire life, her purpose had been defined by the warm, living coal she carried. Now her hands were empty, her duty gone. The cold, useless clay pot was a mockery of her failure. She was no longer the firekeeper. She was just another survivor, another mouth to feed in a world that offered no food. The guilt gnawed at her, a coldness that was worse than the wind. She had let the tribe's soul die, one afternoon, as she sat staring out at the endless gray water. She saw something. It was a flicker of movement on a lower ridge, a place they had assumed was now part of the sea. At first, she thought it was a trick of the eye, a phantom born of hunger and grief. But then she saw it again. A figure, small and hunched, moving slowly, deliberately, towards them. Her heart leaped into her throat, a jolt of fear and hope. Was it one of the enemy tribe, coming to finish them off? She alerted the others, and they watched, their bodies tense, as the figure drew closer. It was not a warrior, it was a child. As the small form climbed the final slope to their hill, a collective gasp of disbelief rippled through the survivors. It was one of the children. From Jorn's family, the ones who had betrayed them and fled in the night. It was the youngest boy, no older than Ilara herself. He was alone, his face streaked with grime and tears, his body trembling with exhaustion. But it was what he carried that made them all stop breathing. He was clutching a clay pot to his chest, and from its lip a tiny, impossible wisp of smoke curled into the gray air. The boy collapsed at their feet, pushing the pot towards them with the last of his strength. "They left me," he choked out, his story tumbling out in broken sobs. His family, in their haste, had seen him as a burden and had abandoned him, leaving him to die. But before they left, he had done something extraordinary. He had stolen back a piece of what they had stolen. He had scooped a single, glowing ember from their fire into his own small pot. He had kept it alive for days, blowing on it, protecting it from the wind and the rain, even as the great wave had crashed below him. He had survived alone, his only companion the fragile, fading coal. Ilara fell to her knees and took the pot from him. She looked inside and saw it, a single, tiny ember, pulsing with a faint, miraculous heat. It was the heart of their tribe, stolen, lost, and now, impossibly, returned. The lost child, a victim of the ultimate betrayal, had become their savior. He had carried their soul back to them. In that moment on the desolate hill of names, a fragile, almost forgotten feeling sparked to life among the survivors. Hope. The fire was not dead. It had survived, just as they had. The return of the fire changed everything. It was a tiny spark, but it was enough to ignite their will to live. With Alara's practiced care, the single ember was coaxed back into a small, steady flame, a warm, golden light in the center of their gray, desolate world. The fire was a magnet, drawing the broken survivors together, their faces illuminated by its gentle glow. It pushed back the physical cold, but more importantly, it began to thaw the ice that had frozen their hearts. For the first time since the Great Wave, they felt something other than grief and fear. They felt a flicker of warmth, a sense of a shared future. With the fire came purpose. The two remaining men, their bodies weak but their spirits rekindled, began to work. They used the heat to harden the tips of sticks, creating crude but effective spears. They ventured down from the hill, not in a desperate, mad hunt, but with a calculated caution. The world the ocean had left behind was a strange and altered place. The flood had scoured the land, but it had also deposited a grim bounty. The shores of the new sea were littered with the debris of the old world. They found the carcasses of sea creatures, strange fish with hard shells and soft bodies, washed up in the tidal pools. It was not the familiar meat of the mammoth or the reindeer, but it was food, and they learned to eat it. They found wood, bleached and smoothed by the salt water, perfect for building rudimentary shelters and for fueling their precious fire. The ocean, the great destroyer, had also become a provider. It had taken their entire world, but it had left behind the raw materials for a new one. The women, led by the quiet strength of Afterlight's mother, began to explore the new landscape. They discovered that the thick, salty mud left by the receding water was drying and cracking in the weak sun, and in those cracks, new plants were beginning to sprout. They were strange, unfamiliar plants with tough leaves and salty roots, but some were edible. They learned by trial and error, cautiously tasting, learning the language of this new earth. The land was gone, the familiar hunting grounds, the sacred groves. The berry patches, all of it lay beneath the gray water. But something remained. A new kind of life was beginning, a tougher, more resilient life born from salt and devastation. They were no longer victims waiting to die. They were becoming something else, scavengers, innovators, students of a new world. They learned to read the tides, to find food in the shells the water left behind, to build shelters from the bones of the sea. The silence that had been filled with grief was now filled with the sounds of work, the chipping of stone, the crackle of the fire, the low murmur of voices planning the next day. The land was gone, but they were still there. The ocean had taken everything from them, but in the wreckage they found the seeds of a new beginning. Weeks turned into a month, and a slow, almost imperceptible change began to occur. It started not on the land, but in the sky. The oppressive, uniform gray that had been their ceiling for so long began to thin. One morning they awoke to see a break in the clouds, a patch of pale, watery blue, the first they had seen since before the darkness. And through that break, a single, weak ray of sunlight pierced the gloom, illuminating their small, windswept hill. They stopped their work and stared, their faces turned upward like plants starved of light. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated wonder. The sun was not the fierce, aggressive star of the great thaw, nor the absent god of the black sky. It was a gentle, hesitant light, its warmth a soft caress on their skin. As the days went on, the clouds continued to part. The sky became a vast, changing canvas of blue and white, a sight so beautiful and so long missed that it brought tears to their eyes. The world, which had been a monochromatic study in gray, was slowly being repainted with color. The sea, once a churning, angry gray, now reflected the blue of the sky, its surface sparkling in the sunlight. With the return of the light came the return of life. The first sign was the birds. They appeared as dark specks against the new blue sky, their calls a sound of startling, joyful music in the long-held silence. They were seabirds, different from the forest birds they had known, but their presence was a profound reassurance. The world was not dead. Life had endured. The birds settled on the new coastlines, and the survivors watched them, learning their habits, their calls becoming a new and welcome part of their daily rhythm. The new plants, which had been struggling in the weak light, now surged with life. The cracked mud flats began to sprout a carpet of tough, green vegetation. Flowers, small and resilient, bloomed in shades of yellow and white, a splash of impossible color against the dark earth. The air, which had smelled only of salt and decay, now carried the fresh, clean scent of new growth. The earth was not just healing. It was being reborn, transformed into something new and unfamiliar, but vibrant and alive. The survivors walked through this changing world with a sense of awe. They were witnessing the birth of a new epoch, the first days of a world remade. The sky was new, the land was new, and they, the last remnants of their tribe, were new as well. They were no longer the people of the ice. They were the children of the flood, standing on the shore of a new world, under a new sky, the new world, demanded a new way of living. The old ways, the ways of the Great Hunt, were buried beneath the sea along with the bones of the mammoth. The daily scavenging for shellfish and edible roots provided enough to survive, but not enough to thrive. The memory of starvation was a ghost that still haunted their nights. They needed a more reliable source of food, a way to create sustenance rather than just find it. The idea did not come in a flash of inspiration, but grew slowly, born from observation and a desperate need for security. It was Afterlight's mother who began it. She noticed that in the places where they discarded the seeds and roots of the wild plants they ate, new shoots would eventually appear. It was a simple connection, one that their ancestors with their abundant hunting grounds had never needed to make. She saw a pattern, a cycle of cause and effect. She began to experiment. Instead of throwing the seeds away, she started to push them into the soft, damp earth near their settlement. In a patch of ground that received the most sun, the others watched her, a mixture of skepticism and curiosity in their eyes. It seemed a strange, hopeful, and perhaps foolish act. Kael, the elder, saw it not as foolishness, but as a profound shift in their thinking. For all of their history, they had been takers, following the herds, gathering what the land offered. What she was doing was different. She was becoming a partner with the land. She was not just taking. She was giving something back, with the hope that the land would give more in return. The first green shoots that pushed their way up from the carefully planted soil were a cause for celebration. It was a small, fragile miracle, but it was a miracle they had made themselves. The tribe began to work together, clearing a larger patch of land, using sharpened sticks to break up the soil. They gathered the seeds from the hardiest plants, the ones that grew best in the salty earth. They learned the rhythm of planting, of watering, of waiting. It was a slow, patient work, so different from the adrenaline and violence of the hunt. It required a different kind of strength, not the strength of a single, explosive moment, but the endurance of hope over a long season. This was not farming as it would be known thousands of years later. It was a crude, desperate beginning, a handful of seeds planted in the mud, but it was a revolution. For the first time, they were not just surviving on the whims of the world. They were shaping it, creating their own small pocket of predictability in a world of chaos. The birth of agriculture began not with a grand discovery, but with the simple, desperate act of a mother trying to ensure her child would not go hungry. It was the moment they stopped being just hunters and gatherers and became something new, the first farmers, planting the first seeds of the future. The small, flickering flame that the lost boy had carried back to them became the heart of a new home. On the windswept hill, overlooking the vast, new sea, they built a settlement. It was not the camp of mammoth bones and hides from their old life, but a collection of small, sturdy huts made from driftwood and woven reeds, plastered with mud that hardened in the sun. At its center, in a carefully constructed stone pit, burned the new fire. It was a constant, reassuring presence, a symbol of their survival and their renewed community. The 17 survivors, once a shattered collection of grieving individuals, began to reform into a tribe. The shared work of building, planting, and foraging wove them together. The old hierarchies, based on the strength of hunters or the wisdom of elders, dissolved. New roles emerged, based on new skills. The man who was best at finding the right kind of wood, the woman who could identify the most nutritious plants, the child with the sharpest eyes for spotting fish in the tidal pools. Each person found their value, their purpose in the collective struggle. They were a circle, smaller and more fragile than the one they had lost, but in many ways stronger. Kael, though still their elder, was no longer just a leader who gave commands. He was a keeper of memories, the living link to the world that was lost. He sat by the fire with the children, including young Afterlight, and he told them the stories. He told them of the great ice, of the mammoth hunts, of the taste of fresh water from a mountain stream. He told them of the drowned, not just as a list of names on a stone, but as people, his sons, his friends, their families. He ensured that the past was not forgotten, that the lessons learned through so much pain were etched into the minds of the new generation. The circle was reformed around a new fire, a new way of life and a new understanding. They were not as many, but they were wiser. They had looked into the face of extinction and had endured. The arrogance of the hunt was replaced by the humility of the harvest. The fear of the elements was replaced by a deep, profound respect for their power. They knew that the world could take everything from them in an instant, and this knowledge made every sunrise, every meal, every shared story a precious gift. One evening as they sat around the fire, sharing the meager meal they had gathered and grown, a sense of peace settled over them. The sound of the waves on the shore below was no longer a threat, but a rhythm, the heartbeat of their new world. The cries of the seabirds were their evening song. They looked at each other's faces in the firelight, the faces of the 17, people who had survived the end of the world, and they saw not just survivors, but family. They were a new tribe, born of flood and fire, and they remembered the drowned, not with overwhelming grief, but with a quiet, solemn promise to live, to thrive, to make their sacrifice mean something. The simple, scratched lines on the boulder at the top of the hill were no longer enough. They were a raw record of grief, but they did not tell the story. As the tribe's new life took root, a collective need arose to create a more permanent, more powerful testament to what they had endured. They needed the stone to do more than list the dead. They needed it to speak. They decided, as a community, to transform the Hill of Names into a monument that would carry their history forward, a warning and a promise for any who might come after them. The work was slow and arduous. Using the hardest, sharpest pieces of flint they could find, they began to carve into the great boulder. This was not the simple scratching of a single afternoon. It was a labor of weeks, a sacred duty performed by every member of the tribe. Kael, with his memory of the old world, guided the narrative. He showed them how to carve symbols, images that could tell the story without words. They were not the elegant, confident paintings of their ancestors in the sacred cave. These were rough, deep, gouged-out images, carved with a desperate need to be permanent. To resist the erosion of wind and rain, they carved the story of the Great Thaw, a jagged line representing the cracking ice. They carved the mammoth, a colossal figure brought down by tiny, stick-like men, a tribute to the hunters they had lost. They carved the shaman's dream, a wave filled with drowning figures, a horrifying image that still haunted their sleep. They depicted the sky turning black, a solid, dark circle eclipsing a sun. They carved the cave, a hollow shape that was both sanctuary and tomb. And at the center of it all, they carved the two things that had defined their survival: a single, tiny, wailing baby and a small, simple pot with a flame rising from it. The monument became the focal point of their lives. It was a school where the children learned their history, a temple where they honored their dead, and a map that charted their journey from one world to the next. It told the story of the flood, of the dead, and of the fire that survived. It was a testament not to their strength, but to their resilience. It did not celebrate victory. It memorialized endurance. When the carving was finally finished, the entire tribe gathered before it. They ran their hands over the rough, deep lines, feeling the story in the stone. The boulder was no longer just a rock. It was a vessel of memory, a silent orator that would tell their story long after their own voices had faded. They had raised a monument not to a king or a god, but to the human spirit's stubborn refusal to be erased. The stone now spoke, and it would continue to speak of the time when the world drowned, ensuring that they, and all they had lost, would never be truly forgotten. Asterisk, asterisk. The seasons turned. The small patch of cultivated land grew larger. The child, Afterlight, took his first steps on the solid ground of the hilltop. Life achieved a new rhythm, a balance between the patient work of farming and the careful scavenging from the sea. The tribe grew, not just in number, as new children were born, but in their understanding of this new world. They learned which woods burned the hottest, which shellfish were sweetest after a storm, and when to plant their seeds to catch the longest days of sun. They were becoming masters of their small island of existence, but the trauma of the flood did not vanish with the return of the sun. It became a part of them, woven into the fabric of their culture, their beliefs, their very souls. It lived on in their nightmares. Even those born after the flood, children who had never seen the great wave, would sometimes wake up screaming in the night, their bodies trembling, their minds filled with inherited visions of drowning. The fear of the water was passed down, a primal terror that flowed from one generation to the next. They built their homes on the highest ground, and no one ever dared to build too close to the shore. The memory of water became their defining tradition. Their stories, told around the fire, were no longer about the glory of the hunt, but about the power and fury of the sea. The ocean was both their provider and their most feared god, a deity to be respected, appeased, and never, ever trusted. Their rituals changed. They no longer prayed for warmth or good hunting. Instead, they made offerings to the sea, casting flowers and a portion of their harvest into the waves, a plea for the water to remain calm, to stay within its bounds. The trauma became a source of wisdom. It taught them humility. It taught them to be cautious, to be prepared, and to value community above all else. They knew from the stories carved on the speaking stone that loyalty was the line between survival and betrayal, that unity was the only shield against a world that could turn hostile without warning. The fear of drowning became a moral compass, guiding their actions and binding them together. They were the people who remembered the water, and that memory, though born of unimaginable pain, became the bedrock of their new society. It was a scar on their collective soul, a permanent reminder of their fragility and their resilience. Asterisk, asterisk, generations passed. The children born on the hill grew old and died, their own stories added to the lore of the tribe. The small settlement became a permanent village. The speaking stone, its carved images softened by centuries of wind and rain, was now an ancient, sacred artifact, its story known by all. The world continued to change. The sea slowly receded from some areas, revealing new lands, while other coastlines continued to crumble. New tribes, also survivors of the great changes, eventually made contact, leading to trade, to conflict, and to the slow, complex intermingling of peoples. The descendants of the 17 survivors spread out, carrying their stories and their deep-seated memory of water with them, the tribe that had huddled in the shadow of the melting glacier, the tribe that had been broken and nearly erased by the flood did not vanish. They endured. They changed. They adapted. The blood of the firekeeper, the elder, the mother, and the child born in smoke flowed on, mixing with the blood of other survivors, becoming part of the great sprawling family of humanity that was repopulating the remade world. Their specific names were forgotten, their language evolved and disappeared, but their legacy was imprinted on the DNA of their descendants. Their story became a myth, a legend told in 1,000 different ways by 1,000 different peoples. It was the story of a great flood, a tale that would echo in the collective memory of cultures all across the globe, a shared scar from a time when the ice melted and the sea rose. They were the people who had faced the end of an epoch and had survived to begin a new one. They were the ones who had learned to plant seeds in the soil of devastation, who had learned to build a future on the bones of the past. They were the tribe that drowned. But their drowning was not an end, it was a baptism. They were submerged in the chaos of a dying world and emerged, gasping and broken, onto the shores of a new one. They did not conquer the world. They did not build empires of stone. Their victory was quieter, more profound. Their victory was survival. They did not vanish. They became the ancestors. They became a part of us all.